If you think you have a choice, you don't. I whispered it to myself as the rain slapped the cracked pavement of the alley, soaking through my hoodie and making the straps of my backpack dig into my shoulders. At 19, I should have been worrying about college applications and part-time shifts at the cafe, not whether I would wake up tomorrow under someone else's control. The neon sign above the corner market flickered in a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat, each buzz slicing through the night air like a warning I didn't understand yet. I had just stepped out from a late shift, balancing a cup of lukewarm coffee and a bag of groceries, when a sleek black car rolled to a stop 2 feet from where I stood. Its headlights cut the dark like laser beams, reflecting off puddles in sharp shards. The engine hummed low and deliberate, a sound that made the hair on my neck prickle. 3 men in tailored suits stepped out, their movements precise, controlled, deliberate, almost rehearsed. The tallest one paused slightly before he approached, and even through the drizzle, I could tell he wasn't someone to bargain with. His presence was a storm contained in a human form, and when he spoke, it wasn't his words but the weight behind them that froze me. "Emily Carter," he said, voice smooth and unyielding, "you're coming with me." I stumbled back instinctively, spilling my coffee, my mind screaming that this had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding, anything but what I was hearing. My lips trembled as I tried to respond, words failing me under the oppressive authority in his gaze. I didn't know who he was, couldn't place him, but the certainty in his tone made it clear that this wasn't optional. My life, my choices, all evaporated like steam from the wet asphalt. The drizzle became a mist around me, the alley narrowing, walls closing in as if the city itself was conspiring to trap me. I felt my backpack slip from my shoulder, my fingers gripping it desperately as if it could anchor me to the world I knew. Behind him, 2 other men stood still, silent sentinels who never blinked, who never moved until commanded, their eyes locked on me like hawks waiting for the signal. I realized then that there would be no negotiation, no pleading that could bend the rules of whatever deal had already been struck. The air tasted metallic, sharp, as if the rain had turned to something harder, heavier. A sense of inevitability sank into my bones, cold and unrelenting. I swallowed hard, tasting fear in the remnants of my abandoned coffee, and took a step back, only to feel the edge of the black car at my side. The tallest man's hand gestured, a subtle, almost courteous motion, and I understood that motion meant more than words ever could. I was to go with him. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Authority wrapped around me, a tangible, invisible force pressing in, compressing every thought into one, compliance. My legs felt like lead, each step toward the car heavier than the last, and with every breath, I could feel the weight of eyes on me, calculating, measuring, judging. I glanced up at his face for the first time, dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that pinned me in place, and I could see no malice, no cruelty, just absolute command. The city seemed to fade around us, neon reflections blurring into streaks of color on the wet asphalt, the sounds of traffic distant, irrelevant. The leather of the car seats smelled of polish and something faintly metallic, a scent that made my stomach churn with a mix of fear and awe. I sat down reluctantly, the door clicking shut behind me with a sound that echoed in the silence like a verdict. I gripped the edge of the seat, knuckles white, listening as the car started, engine purring smoothly, the tires slicing through puddles. Every mile took me further from the life I had known, every turn the city blurred into a canvas of shadows. He didn't speak again for several minutes, but his presence was constant, a steady pressure that made my thoughts scatter and regroup around him. I realized with a sinking certainty that at 19, I was stepping into a world where I would have to learn to navigate someone else's rules, a world of power and control that had nothing to do with me, and yet everything depended on how I reacted. The night stretched endlessly outside the windows, lights flickering. Past, reflections of a life already slipping away, and I knew in the pit of my stomach that nothing would ever be the same. The drive to the estate was quiet except for the soft hum of the tires over wet asphalt, each reflection of the streetlight sliding across the black leather interior like a painting I could not escape. Emily Carter sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands clutching the edge of the cushion, knuckles white, her mind racing to understand how quickly her world had shifted. Outside, the city blurred into streaks of orange and yellow, the occasional puddle reflecting the neon glow from signs she could not name. The mansion loomed ahead, grand and imposing, its windows aglow with warm light that promised luxury and something else she could not yet identify. When the car finally came to a smooth stop in the circular driveway, the engine ticking down to silence, she felt the weight of anticipation pressing against her chest, making each breath shallow and deliberate. Henry Sullivan stepped out first, tall and imposing in a tailored navy suit, his posture immaculate, every movement deliberate, radiating authority that was impossible to ignore. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, clinging to his dark hair and sharp features, glinting like tiny diamonds in the light of the driveway lamps. Emily rose slowly, her legs stiff, eyes never leaving his as he gestured toward the front door with a hand that suggested invitation and command simultaneously. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and a subtle hint of citrus, a surprising warmth that contrasted the cold certainty she had felt in the alley moments before. Henry walked ahead, his footsteps echoing softly on the marble floors, and Emily followed, feeling the unfamiliar textures under her shoes, the smoothness of the railings, the soft hum of distant appliances, and the subtle creak of a floorboard as though the house itself was breathing. She noted the size of the rooms, the art on the walls, abstract paintings that seemed to capture movement and emotion she did not fully understand yet, each frame a testament to a life built on wealth and control. Henry paused at a doorway, his eyes briefly flicking toward hers, and in that glance she caught a shadow of recognition, a subtle indication that he understood fear, yet was unfazed by it. Emily lowered her gaze, noticing her own reflection in the polished brass handles, realizing how small she felt in comparison, not just physically, but in every way that mattered within this space. They moved through the foyer into a sitting room, the air slightly warmer here, the smell of fresh linen and leather mingling, creating a sensation that was both inviting and disorienting. A cup of tea appeared on a side table as if placed by invisible hands, steam curling in delicate patterns, and Emily instinctively reached for it, the warmth of the porcelain grounding her in the present while her thoughts spun with what had brought her here. Henry remained standing, tall and composed, his gaze scanning the room with calculated precision before settling on her again, that same quiet intensity that made it impossible to look away. She sipped the tea, tasting a hint of honey and chamomile, a simple comfort in the midst of an overwhelming night, feeling a flicker of control return with each careful breath. The room seemed to shrink and expand at once, the vastness of the mansion contrasted by the intimacy of the encounter, the subtle rules of the house making themselves known in the quiet of shared space. Emily realized with a jolt that while she had been swept into this world without consent, there was a rhythm to it, a pattern she could begin to observe, a sequence of gestures and glances that hinted at the boundaries and expectations she would need to navigate. And even as the tea warmed her hands, her heart beat with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and the faintest trace of anticipation, knowing that the night was only beginning and that every step she took within these walls would teach her the meaning of power, control, and the delicate balance between compliance and understanding. Emily followed silently as Henry led her through the grand corridors of the mansion, her steps echoing softly on the polished marble floors. Each room they passed was filled with a meticulous arrangement of furniture and art, the kind of details that suggested wealth accumulated over decades and a life lived with precision. She tried to take in the scents, the faint smell of polished wood mixed with the subtle tang of citrus and leather, each inhale anchoring her to the reality that she could not escape. Henry did not speak, but his presence communicated more than words ever could, the quiet control in his posture, the way his eyes measured her reactions without judgment, an unspoken expectation that she would adapt to the rhythm of his world. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of unspoken rules pressing down as they entered a study with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the spines of leather-bound tomes glowing in the warm lamplight. A fire crackled in the hearth, sending flickers of orange light across the walls and floor, creating moving shadows that danced in silent harmony with the room. Henry gestured toward a chair with a nod, and Emily sat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap, feeling every fiber of her being on alert yet compelled to comply. He circled the room slowly, eyes scanning not only her but the arrangement of the space, noting her posture, her breathing, her hesitation, as if each detail mattered in a subtle choreography only he understood. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, broken only by the occasional pop from the fire and the muted tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. Emily realized that every movement, every breath, was observed, catalogued, and weighed, a constant reminder of the structure and control surrounding her. She lifted her gaze to meet his again, and for the first time since the alley, there was a flicker of something softer, a hint of curiosity or perhaps recognition, in the intensity of his eyes. It made her heart catch in a way that was confusing and compelling, a sensation that reminded her she was still very much alive and capable of thought within the confines of a world she did not yet understand. Henry finally spoke, his voice low and measured, carrying the authority that had defined every moment of her night. "This is your first night here. Everything you see, everything you encounter, will be a lesson in how this place operates. Observe carefully, and do not act impulsively. Emily nodded, swallowing hard, the weight of the words settling deep in her chest. She could feel the pulse of the house, the rhythm of its operation, and she knew that understanding would be her only tool for navigating the days ahead. Henry moved toward the window, his silhouette framed by the city lights beyond, and the glow of Manhattan stretching like a living map beneath them, and for a moment, the enormity of her situation hit her in waves, a mixture of awe and apprehension. She took a careful sip of water from a crystal glass left on a side table, the cool liquid grounding her senses, and allowed herself to notice the small details, the way the firelight flickered across the spines of the books, the texture of the rug under her feet, the faint hum of life outside the mansion walls, each element a reminder that while her world had shifted irrevocably, she was still present, still aware, still capable of learning and adapting. Henry turned, his expression unreadable, yet the weight behind his gaze made her aware that the next step she would take would shape not only her immediate survival but her understanding of power, responsibility, and the delicate balance between compliance and self-possession in a world ruled by invisible yet absolute rules. Emily followed Henry down a long corridor lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass, casting reflections that flickered like distant stars across the marble floor. The mansion smelled faintly of polished wood, fresh linens, and something subtly herbal, a combination that made the air feel both crisp and strangely welcoming. Henry moved with quiet authority, each step deliberate, the soft click of his shoes against the marble marking a rhythm she instinctively tried to match, aware of every subtle motion he made. As they reached a smaller sitting area, she noticed a low table with books neatly stacked and a tray of refreshments, arranged with meticulous care. Henry gestured toward a chair and Emily sat cautiously, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, feeling the cool leather under her fingertips. He remained standing, his eyes surveying the space, then shifted to her, the intensity in his gaze palpable yet not oppressive, as if measuring not only her reaction but her capacity to adjust to the environment. The fire from the hearth danced across his features, highlighting the lines that spoke of age and experience, yet in his posture and demeanor there was no fragility, only calculated composure. Emily sipped water from a crystal glass, the smooth chill grounding her thoughts, allowing her to momentarily focus on the tactile sensations of her surroundings rather than the enormity of her situation. Henry moved closer, his footsteps slow, deliberate, a subtle indication that he was aware of her nervousness and intended to maintain control while not startling her. He spoke, his voice measured, carrying a calm authority that commanded attention without raising volume. You will need to observe closely and follow the flow of this household. Everything here operates with precision and intention. Nothing is random. Emily nodded, swallowing hard, her throat dry, aware that her compliance would be the first test of understanding and adaptation. Outside, the city hummed quietly beneath the towering structures, the distant sounds of traffic softened by the elevation of the mansion. She took in the textures, the warmth radiating from the fireplace, the soft rug beneath her feet, the subtle scent of aged leather from the books, realizing that these small details formed the framework of the space she now occupied. Henry circled the sitting area once, his gaze never leaving hers, noting posture, breathing, and the minute shifts in expression, a silent assessment that made her acutely aware of how every motion she made was registered. When he finally paused, standing near the window, he allowed a moment of quiet reflection, his silhouette framed by the glow of Manhattan far below, a city alive with movement and energy while she sat on the cusp of an unfamiliar world. The gravity of her new environment settled over her, and for the first time, Emily began to sense the patterns and expectations inherent in her surroundings, understanding that while she had no say in how she arrived here, the way she responded would define her navigation of the days and nights to come. Each breath she took felt purposeful, each glance measured, as she began to internalize the rhythm of the household, recognizing that adaptation would be her only form of agency in a life suddenly structured by someone else's unyielding standards and quiet authority. Emily spent the first hour exploring the sitting room quietly, her fingers brushing over the smooth surfaces of the furniture, the edges of books, and the soft texture of the rug beneath her. She tried to memorize every detail, the layout, the lighting, the subtle cues that signaled comfort and control at the same time. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, sending flickering light across the polished floors, and she realized that each shadow, each glow, had its place and purpose, much like the silent rhythm of Henry Sullivan's movements. He observed her closely from across the room, arms crossed lightly, the intensity of his gaze unwavering yet not imposing, as though he was gauging her ability to adapt, to notice, to integrate herself into this new environment. Emily sipped another glass of water, the coolness grounding her thoughts, and felt a small measure of focus returning. Henry gestured toward a sideboard where carefully arranged documents and objects rested, and she understood that these were not merely decorative, each had meaning, each had function, and each required observation to comprehend. She rose slowly and approached, her hand hovering over a ledger, her fingers tracing the spine lightly, feeling the weight of structure and order that Henry had instilled in every part of the mansion. He spoke softly, his voice carrying authority and quiet expectation. "Everything here has a place, Emily. Learn the rhythm, and you will understand more than you expect." She nodded, swallowing hard, her heartbeat settling slightly as she processed the instruction, aware that obedience was not simply about action but about perception, about seeing the intent behind every detail. The city lights outside glimmered faintly through the tall windows, casting shifting reflections across the floor that mimicked the subtle changes in expression on Henry's face. Emily realized that while she had been thrust into this world without choice, she had the power to observe, to understand, to learn the unspoken rules that governed this place. Henry moved to a small console, adjusting a panel of lights and sounds that subtly altered the ambience, and Emily noticed how each change affected the atmosphere, how the room responded to small gestures with large impact, a lesson in attention to detail and consequence. The hum of the mansion, the soft mechanical whispers of automated systems, and the precise flow of light and shadow created a world that was both intimidating and mesmerizing. She felt the weight of his presence, steady and constant, a reminder that while she was a newcomer, the mansion had its own heartbeat, one she could synchronize with if she chose to pay attention. Each step she took, each careful glance, was an exercise in adaptation, and she began to notice patterns, the way Henry's eyes moved, the subtle cues that indicated shifts in expectation or mood. She realized that her survival, her ability to navigate this space, depended not on resistance but on observation, on patience, and on the quiet cultivation of awareness. The firelight danced across the walls as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and Emily felt herself settling into a rhythm of quiet attentiveness, understanding that the mansion, Henry, and this new chapter in her life were all interconnected in ways that required both vigilance and openness. Her pulse gradually steadied, each breath measured and intentional, as she began to recognize that while she had arrived in this world without choice, the way she engaged with it would define her ability to endure, to learn, and perhaps to influence the rhythm of this carefully orchestrated environment. Henry led Emily through the expansive halls with an air of quiet authority, each step measured, each motion deliberate, and she felt the weight of observation pressing against her senses. The walls were lined with abstract paintings and sculptures that seemed to watch as much as the security cameras she had noticed earlier, their presence both intimidating and mesmerizing. The soft hum of the lighting system above created a calm rhythm, contrasting with the rush of adrenaline still lingering in her veins from the alley and the drive, and she found herself paying attention to every subtle sound, every shift in the mansion's ambient atmosphere. He gestured toward a small library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, where volumes of books sat neatly arranged, their spines uniform in color and texture, and Emily recognized the meticulous order as a reflection of his personality, precise, controlled, intentional. She stepped inside, the hardwood floor cool beneath her shoes, and allowed herself to run her fingers along the edge of a table, feeling the polished wood and the faint warmth from the fire in the next room. Henry remained by the doorway, his posture commanding yet unobtrusive, allowing her the space to explore while maintaining a silent assessment. "Notice the patterns," he said finally, his voice low and steady, "the placement of objects, the arrangement of the rooms, the way light moves through the space. This is a lesson in observation and patience." Emily nodded, the words sinking in slowly, understanding that these small details were integral to adapting to the environment and navigating the expectations that came with her presence here. She moved through the shelves, picking up a book to examine the weight of it, the texture of the pages, and noting the precision of the calligraphy on the spines, appreciating the deliberate design and the care with which the mansion was maintained. Henry's eyes followed her every movement, a silent gauge of awareness and attentiveness, yet there was no pressure to perform beyond simply observing, understanding that awareness was the first step to comprehension. The mansion seemed alive with subtle signals, the flicker of the fireplace casting shadows that shifted with each movement, the faint hum of the heating system creating a constant background presence, the distant sound of a fountain outside adding a serene cadence to the environment. Emily felt herself adjusting to the rhythm, noting the way Henry moved, the subtle shifts in his posture, and the way his gaze conveyed both authority and a reserved patience that demanded respect without immediate intimidation. She realized that while she had no control over how she had arrived here, her capacity to observe, to integrate, and to respond deliberately would define her experience in this new world. Every glance, every movement, every breath became a lesson, a silent exercise in attunement to the patterns of the household, and she felt a growing sense of purpose in her attentiveness. The soft warmth of the fireplace, the subtle scent of polished wood and citrus, and the quiet authority radiating from Henry formed a triad of influence that Emily began to understand as both a framework for her conduct and a guide for adaptation. As she seated herself again, taking in the room with heightened awareness, she noticed how her perception sharpened, catching details she had missed before: the subtle curvature of a table leg, the positioning of a lamp casting a precise shadow, the way Henry's eyes followed her without intrusion. She understood that the mansion and its owner were teaching her not through words alone but through presence, through the arrangement of space, and through the silent expectation of attention, patience, and measured response, and she felt herself slowly aligning with this rhythm, realizing that her observation and deliberate engagement would be her most powerful tools in the days ahead. Emily had been seated by the large bay window for what felt like hours, observing the city lights stretching endlessly beneath her, each car and street lamp a flickering testament to the world she had left behind. Henry moved silently around the room, adjusting objects, straightening papers, and occasionally glancing at her with a quiet intensity that demanded attention without words. She noticed the subtle shifts in his expression, the way a flick of his hand altered the angle of a lamp, the way his eyes scanned the bookshelves as though cataloging each title not merely for content but for meaning. Her own awareness sharpened as she watched, noticing how the reflection of the firelight in the window highlighted the edges of his silhouette, the exact placement of his feet on the polished floor, the rhythm of his breathing. She realized that this attention to detail, this quiet control, was not merely about the mansion but about understanding him, understanding the rules of the environment he had created, and the implicit expectations that governed her behavior within it. Henry finally spoke, his voice measured and calm, carrying the weight of experience. "You will learn that observation is more than seeing, it is understanding context, intention, and consequence. Pay attention to what is not said as much as what is stated." Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, aware that her survival and adaptation depended on absorbing the unspoken lessons embedded in every object, every gesture, every subtle cue. She rose carefully, walking toward a desk where an assortment of papers and folders lay, each arranged with meticulous precision. Her fingertips brushed the edges of the folders, noting the texture, the alignment, the subtle variance in color, and she understood that each small detail conveyed information, a silent language that Henry had developed over years of experience and that now she needed to decode. As she worked to internalize the lessons of arrangement, rhythm, and pattern, she felt a strange mixture of comfort and tension, the mansion imposing order while simultaneously demanding her attention, her compliance, and her focus. Henry returned to her side briefly, observing her movements without comment, the intensity in his gaze unwavering yet devoid of any harshness. Emily felt the subtle pressure of his presence, a constant reminder that while she was navigating new territory, she was not alone, and that understanding the rhythms of this world was crucial. The firelight flickered across the surfaces, casting shadows that danced along the walls and the furniture, creating patterns she began to trace mentally, learning to anticipate the shifts and movements within the room. She noted the placement of every chair, every book, the angle of each lamp, and she felt her confidence slowly building, knowing that comprehension of the environment would grant her a measure of control and clarity. Henry stepped back toward the window, his silhouette framed by the glow of the city below, and Emily sensed that while she had been thrust into a world she had not chosen, she could begin to navigate it through attentiveness, observation, and careful reflection, learning not only the rules of the mansion but the subtle cues of behavior, the patterns of authority, and the rhythm of life within a place governed by deliberate precision, where understanding would become her most valuable tool. Emily sat quietly in the study, her eyes tracing the lines of the bookshelves and the patterns of light cast by the flickering fire. She had begun to understand that the mansion operated on rhythms, subtle and deliberate, and each object, each placement, was a lesson in attention, awareness, and careful observation. Henry stood nearby, his hands clasped behind his back, watching without interruption, his presence both grounding and imposing. The quiet of the room allowed her to focus on the minutiae, the angle of the lamp, the alignment of the books, the way shadows shifted and changed with the light. Each small detail carried significance, a reflection of the precision and control that defined Henry's world. As she moved slowly to a side table to adjust a stack of papers, she realized that the rhythm of the mansion was more than physical arrangement, it was a lesson in patience, timing, and deliberate action. She could feel the weight of Henry's gaze on her, noting the smallest gestures, the way she held her posture, the way her breathing adjusted to the space around her. "Observe everything," he said softly, his voice calm but carrying the authority of experience, "and learn what it means to belong here. Not through fear, but through understanding and attentiveness." Emily nodded, taking a deep breath, feeling the steadiness in his tone and the deliberate pace at which he moved, and she began to see patterns emerge in her own actions, the way she could adjust movements to anticipate reactions, the way attention to detail allowed her to interact with the environment purposefully. The mansion felt alive with subtle signals, the soft hum of the lighting, the quiet creak of the floor, the gentle flicker of the fire, and Emily recognized that comprehension was not about immediate action but about learning to perceive, to adapt, and to align with the unspoken structure of the household. She adjusted the papers, noticing how the light fell on the edges, how the shadows created shapes that conveyed depth, and she felt a sense of accomplishment in understanding the logic of the space. Henry remained still, observing, and Emily understood that he was providing the guidance of presence, allowing her to learn the rhythms without interference, his quiet authority teaching her that compliance and understanding were intertwined. Outside, the city lights reflected through the large windows, the faint glow of Manhattan stretching into the distance, and she felt the enormity of the mansion, its order, and the subtle power it held, recognizing that her perception and careful attention could grant her insight, clarity, and a measure of agency within a world she had not chosen but could learn to navigate. Each measured step she took, each deliberate glance, became a lesson in patience, awareness, and alignment with the rhythms of power, and she felt herself absorbing the principles of observation, careful engagement, and thoughtful action that would define her ability to move through the mansion, understand its authority, and begin to grasp the balance between presence and belonging, all under the quiet guidance of Henry Sullivan, whose steady observation and unwavering attention to detail provided a framework for her to adapt, comprehend, and anticipate the unspoken rules of this new chapter in her life. Emily stood near the tall window, her reflection faint against the vast expanse of city lights stretching endlessly below, each flicker of movement outside reminding her that the world she once knew was still there, just beyond reach. The mansion had grown quieter as the night deepened, the subtle hum of its systems and the distant crackle of the fire forming a steady rhythm that she had begun to recognize, almost anticipate. Henry remained across the room, his posture composed, his presence unwavering, watching her not with urgency but with a kind of deliberate patience that felt more instructive than controlling. She realized that the silence between them was no longer empty, it was filled with observation, with unspoken expectations, with the steady exchange of awareness that defined everything in this place. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the window frame, the cool surface grounding her thoughts as she took a slow breath, noticing how her heartbeat had steadied compared to the chaos of earlier that night. She had not chosen to be here, that truth still sat heavy in her chest, but something within her had shifted, something subtle and undeniable, as though the act of observing, of understanding, had given her a small but significant sense of control. Henry finally stepped closer, his footsteps quiet against the floor, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority that had guided every moment since she arrived. "You are beginning to see it now. The structure. The rhythm. This is how you learn to navigate what you cannot change." Emily turned slightly to face him, her eyes searching his, no longer filled only with fear but with a cautious awareness, a growing comprehension of the world she had been brought into. She noticed the details she might have missed before, the way the light caught the silver in his hair, the steadiness in his gaze, the absence of unnecessary movement, everything about him reflecting the same precision as the mansion itself. "I did not agree to this," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of her words, and for a brief moment the air between them seemed to shift, not with tension, but with recognition. Henry nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement rather than a dismissal, and his reply came measured and composed. "Agreement is not always where a story begins. But understanding is where it changes." The words settled into her thoughts, echoing softly as she turned her gaze back toward the city, the lights now appearing less distant and more like something she could still connect to, even from within these walls. She realized then that while she could not control the circumstances that brought her here, she could control how she responded, how she observed, how she learned. The mansion no longer felt like an unknown space pressing in on her, but rather a structure she could begin to understand, piece by piece, detail by detail. The firelight flickered behind her, casting a warm glow that contrasted with the cool glass beneath her fingertips, and she felt the balance of those sensations as a reflection of her own state, caught between uncertainty and clarity, between resistance and adaptation. Henry stepped back once more, giving her space, his presence still felt but no longer overwhelming, and Emily understood that this was part of the lesson as well, the balance between proximity and distance, between control and allowance. As she stood there, watching the city breathe beyond the glass, she felt something settle within her, a quiet realization that this night had not only taken something from her, but had also given her a new awareness, a new way of seeing, and perhaps the beginning of a strength she had not known she possessed, because in a world defined by power, the ability to understand it might be the only way to stand within it without losing herself.